First of all, I think, to play on an old adage, show me who you want released in a hostage deal, and I'll show you who you are. I mean, if one can imagine people calling for the release of West, and if one can imagine calling for the release of the Yorkshire Ripper, and one can imagine calling for the release of Jack the Ripper, or in American terms, if one can imagine calling for the release of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and some of the most notorious murderers in the world, that gives you some idea as to the horrific character and nature of the people that Hamas wants to have released. The interesting differential there is that whereas Rose and Fred West don't represent anyone other than their own murderous viewpoints and intentions, and the Yorkshire Ripper didn't represent anyone except their own murderous intentions, and Jeffrey Dahmer didn't represent anyone except their own murderous intentions, the people that Hamas want to have released actually represent that which Hamas is educating its children to believe, to adopt the philosophy of, and to ultimately carry out, as we saw so many of them do so once they became of adult age on October the 7th. And so it's a particularly macabre deal. It's an awful deal because it's separated into different stages. So it starts with women first, and then eventually goes to men, and then you go down the sliding scale of Hamas demands, and eventually somewhere down the line they come to the release of body parts of people who have been killed. So this is an awful, awful situation. In terms of my personal ideas about it, I think that we must do everything that we possibly can in order to bring our hostages home. They have been languishing there for far too long, 171 days already, since being abducted during the most brutal and murderous rampage against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I think that bringing them home is vital to our war goals, but also destroying Hamas's military capabilities is vital to our war goals. And so I think if we need to have a temporary pause, not a ceasefire, and certainly not a long-term ceasefire, but a temporary pause in order to bring our hostages back to their loved ones and to their countries, we would do well to avail ourselves of that possibility. But then we must also ratchet up the war machine and move forward to crush, destroy, and eliminate Hamas's military capabilities. It's vital that we do that. And even as there's much talk in the international media and in various international fora about the need for Prime Minister Netanyahu to step aside at this time, Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Senate Majority Leader over there in the United States of America, also the highest ranking Jewish elected representative in the United States of America at this time, calling for elections right now from the Senate floor, from the well of the Senate floor. He can do that and he can say that, but it's very, very clear that he fails to understand that whomever is in the position of leadership here in Israel, that individual has only one mandate from the Israeli people, and that is to achieve the dual war goals, bringing back the hostages, destroying Hamas's military capabilities. The latter part of those two goals, that will not change regardless of who is in the seat of the prime minister. Yeah, the Israel Defense Forces has got to operate inside Rafah, and it's got to operate inside Rafah with the same conclusive goals as it has done in Gaza City, as it has done in Jabalia, as it has done and continues to do in Khan Yunis. There is absolutely no sense whatsoever in this completely artificial red line that has been drawn around two aspects of the war. The first is a calendrical aspect, the idea that we should not be making war inside the Gaza Strip during the month of Ramadan. This is completely artificial. It's complete nonsense. Everybody should note and appreciate the fact that no deference was shown to the Jewish calendar when Hamas stormed across our border during the festival of Simchat Torah, where the Jewish people celebrate the receipt of the Torah, of the Bible, from Mount Sinai. Murdered 1,200 people. This is a number that seems to be fading into the background, but I want to place it back onto the foreground. Murdered 1,200 people, kidnapped 240 others, are holding 134 inside their dungeons and their tunnels to this day. Our hostages are languishing. And quite frankly, the timeline along which we operate in order to bring those hostages home, whose lives hang in the balance every day, And given particularly the fact that the UN investigation into sex as a weapon of war determined that our female hostages were not only likely raped on October 7th by Hamas and gang raped by Hamas on October 7th, but also are even more likely to still being raped and sexually abused inside Hamas captivity now. Given those considerations, I don't think that we have any requirement whatsoever to be deferential to the calendar of, frankly, any people when it comes to achieving our primary goal here, and that is to bring our hostages home. So yes, we have to operate in Rafah. We have to do so extensively. We have to do so powerfully. And I believe that we have to hold the Rafah crossing in perpetuity once we take control of that area, because so much of what took place on October 7th was facilitated by the bringing in of contraband, personnel, even military know-how from the Sinai Peninsula via the Rafah crossing or another crossing that's just adjacent to the Rafah crossing, and then into the Gaza Strip. Hamas terrorists moved from the Gaza Strip into the Sinai. They then traveled up to Lebanon, then to Syria, then to Iraq, and then to Iran. And they were trained along the way by Iranians. And then they came back in the reverse of that route, back through the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip, and then launched this massacre against the people of Israel on October 7th. So we're going to have to take that town, and we're going to have to hold that crossing. So the reality of the matter is that I spoke earlier about a mandate from the people of Israel for the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. The Prime Minister of the State of Israel started to deliver truckloads, hundreds of truckloads daily to Gazans through the crossings, the various crossings, particularly Kerem Shalom crossing and others, so that famine, starvation, a humanitarian catastrophe would be avoided. And incidentally, it has been avoided. The stories about mass famine and mass starvation, those don't seem to be backed up by facts or evidence. The most recent article that I read about that number was that there were approximately 20 children who were being treated for malnutrition at this time. Certainly a very difficult circumstance, but by no means mass famine by any stretch of the imagination. Now, the Prime Minister did that and started to move those aid trucks in revolt of what the Israeli people felt needed to happen at that time. I want that to be very, very clear. It was done as a nod, if you like, to the demands of the Americans. The Americans said, we will continue to supply you with all of the material that you need in order to prosecute this war against Hamas, but we need a humanitarian gesture. And the humanitarian gesture was the inflow of food and nourishment to the Gaza Strip.